instantly establishing a territorial claim on the queen's flank. This move prepares to control central squares indirectly. Embracing a fianchetto, black concedes central space for diagonal influence, preparing to develop their bishop to a powerful outpost. Establishing central influence and preparing for kingside development. Unleashing the fianchettoed bishop prepares a powerful diagonal assault, aiming to control key central squares and create dynamic attacking potential. Solidifying the queenside and preparing a fianchetto, white opts for a flexible king's Indian attack setup, aiming for queenside expansion. Developing the knight here prepares for castling and exerts pressure on white's central pawn structure. Solidifying the fianchettoed bishop's influence across the long diagonal creates a powerful central presence. Castling tucks the king away, establishing a sound defensive posture and preparing for eventual central pawn breaks. Solidifying the center, this pawn advance now prepares for eventual e4, aiming to exploit the open diagonal for the bishop. Solidifying the pawn chain and opening a diagonal for the queen and bishop, this move prepares for piece development and central influence. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for a kingside pawn storm, this move also opens a diagonal for the queen, creating a more robust setup behind the castled king. Initiating a pawn clash in the center immediately livens up the board, challenging white's space advantage and opening crucial diagonals. Developing the knight to e2 instead of the more common f3 sidesteps potential future conflicts on the f-file and keeps the f3 square open, perhaps for a pawn push later on, while also preparing to bolster the central pawn chain and lending a hand to the kingside defense. Solidifying the center with a pawn provides a sturdy foundation for black's pieces and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queenside, aiming to gain queenside space and potentially target white's d3 pawn. Seizing central space, white boldly asserts control of the d4 square, potentially locking down black's queenside development and forcing a confrontation in the very heart of the board. Opening up the queenside to create attacking chances on that flank, black disrupts white's harmonious development and prepares to challenge the d4 square. Securing the king initiates a strategic regrouping, preparing to activate the pieces for central control and potential pawn breaks. Securing the queen's knight's egress with n6, black aims to reposition it to a more active square, perhaps c7 or b4, while simultaneously preparing for a queenside pawn advance. This subtly shifts the battleground, promising to contest the open lines that white's central pawn push has created. Establishing a robust defensive perimeter around the king becomes paramount after black's knight swings to the queenside. Proactively securing the rook on a more active square prevents immediate pressure on the queenside and prepares for potential pawn pushes like b5, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay along the b-file. Shaping the board's intricate geometry, this bishop's advance immediately questions the central pawn structure and attempts to disrupt black's nascent queenside expansion by leveraging the knight's placement. Challenging the bishop's dominion on the kingside, this pawn advance seeks to gain breathing room and potentially open lines for counterplay, but it does so at the cost of weakening the dark squares around the king. Preparing to gently expand queenside territory and potentially challenge black's knight's outpost, white repositions the bishop to a less passive square, fostering peace harmony and hinting at future pawn pushes like f4, which could open lines towards the king. Unleashing a pawn thrust on the queenside, black aims to disrupt white's solid central setup and carve out space. This aggressive maneuver not only contests the b4 square, a potential springboard for white's pieces, but also prepares to challenge the c-file once it opens. It's a strategic gamble, seeking to exploit the slightly uncoordinated nature of white's knights and bishop on the queenside, forcing them into more passive defensive postures or potentially creating weaknesses if they overextend. Unveiling the queen to d2 signifies white's intention to connect rooks and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside or center, while also offering the queen a more active central role, and eyeing the b2 pawn should black overextend on the queenside. Securing the king from potential future pawn advances on the kingside, and preparing to shift focus towards the queenside initiative represents a sound defensive maneuver, solidifying the monarch's shelter while subtly hinting at a potential queenside expansion. Embracing the open lines that this capture creates, white initiates a positional gambit, exchanging pawn structure for immediate central influence, forcing black to consider the long-term consequences of his uncastled king and fragmented queenside. Opening up the c-file presents an immediate challenge for black, forcing a decision on how to manage the newly exposed pawn structure. Reinforcing the central e4 pawn and preparing to contest the open c-file, this maneuver aims to activate the rook and potentially pressure black's queenside structure. Unleashing a dynamic pawn thrust, black immediately disrupts white's queenside structure, aiming to seize the initiative and exploit the potentially exposed knight on c3. The advanced pawn now exerts pressure, potentially forcing white into a defensive posture or a strategic concession. Unleashing a central pawn grab, this knight maneuver instantly challenges black's queenside pawn structure and attempts to dominate the d5 outpost, potentially creating imbalances and forcing concessions. Accepting the knight exchange simplifies black's position, surrendering central control for potential piece activity on the queenside. However, it opens the c-file for white's rook and relinquishes the e5 pawn's defensive structure, potentially creating targets for white's pieces, especially if white can coordinate attacks along the newly formed open lines. Opening the e-file here offers immediate central control and potentially disrupts black's queenside expansion. It's a bold pawn thrust aimed at wresting initiative. Developing the bishop to d7 stabilizes the queenside pawn structure and aims to reinforce the queenside advance, while also preparing for potential pawn pushes like b4 or c5 later on. Unleashing the d-pawn seizes central space, aiming to pry open the position and exploit the now exposed kingside. Relinquishing the e-file to white's rook is a strategic concession, opening a direct line towards black's kingside, but it aims to foster better piece mobility on the queenside and potentially leverage the queenside pawns. Unlocking the d-file with this pawn capture immediately creates dynamic tension, forcing black to address the newly opened central pathway and potentially compromising their pawn structure with a recapture. Seizing the open file on the d-file is a pressing necessity after white's pawn push, so recapturing with the e-pawn is the natural and forced continuation, immediately contesting the central tension and preventing white from consolidating further gains. Unlocking the d-file for significant pressure against black's somewhat precarious king, this placement is a bold assertion of white's intent to seize initiative. The rook's presence here isn't just about controlling a single file. It's about creating a potential battering ram, eyeing squares like d6 and preparing for potential sacrifices or pawn pushes that could unravel black's defenses. This injection of central force demands immediate attention, forcing black to consider defensive maneuvers rather than continuing their queenside expansion. Introducing the knight to c7 is a fascinating, albeit somewhat passive, maneuver. It aims to shore up the e5 pawn and potentially reroute the knight to e6 for defense, but it feels a bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. White's pieces are poised for an assault on the queenside, particularly targeting the pawn and controlling the open c-file. Black's kingside remains relatively safe, but the queenside is developing into a battlefield where black seems to be on the defensive. The challenge for black will be to untangle these pieces and find active counterplay before white's pressure becomes overwhelming. Liberating the d-pawn injects immediate dynamism, creating a forceful passed pawn that demands black's attention and disrupts any semblance of structural harmony, potentially forcing concessions to maintain material equality. The knight's audacious leap to b5 aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially seize control of the a7-g1 diagonal, but it leaves the c7 square undefended and might become a target for white's rook on c1. White boldly advances the kingside pawn, aiming to pry open lines and create attacking chances against black's castled king, a direct challenge initiated by this aggressive pawn push. Black seeks to shatter white's seemingly solid pawn structure by initiating a bold kingside pawn thrust, aiming to exploit the potential weakness of white's king. Once the central tension resolves, and diagonals open up. Cracking open the kingside is the intent here, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's monarch and disrupt its currently solid defense. The pawn storm finally breaks open, and black embraces the ensuing chaos by reclaiming the central pawn, aiming to exploit the newly liberated diagonal for the bishop and potentially create counterplay on the open files. Initiating a central pawn storm to shatter black's solid structure, this audacious push gambles on opening lines for the bishop and queen, aiming to exploit the now unsupported f-pawn and potentially destabilize the black king's sanctuary. Pushing the e4 pawn bravely forward creates a dynamic frontier, potentially disrupting white's kingside coordination and seeking counterplay on the open queenside files. Securing the king's escape route from any potential discovered attacks along the now open diagonal offers a crucial safety net, allowing for more aggressive piece maneuvering. Unleashing the rook to e6 seizes a crucial open file, injecting dynamism into black's position and potentially challenging white's central pawn structure. Focusing the bishop towards the d6 pawn creates a powerful battery on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack. Unleashing the rook to a more active square, this maneuver aims to put pressure on white's slightly extended pawn chain and potentially exploit the open files that might arise, creating dynamic play in the center and queenside. Unleashing the rook onto the open file immediately puts pressure on black's position and challenges the central pawn chain. Finally, black repositions the bishop from its awkward corner to a more active diagonal, eyeing the g-pawn and preparing to support potential advances on the kingside. Challenging the rook's dominance on the open file, this repositioning aims to regain control of the vital h-file, potentially setting up future threats against the black king now that it's less exposed behind the f-pawn. Unveiling the queen to d7 aims to connect the rooks, prepare for potential central pawn pushes, and offer a more active role for the monarch on the 7th rank, perhaps as a defensive outpost or even an attacking piece. Unleashing the knight to g3 aims to disrupt black's queenside initiative by potentially targeting weak pawns or creating new attacking avenues, but it risks neglecting the central pawn structure and king safety as the game intensifies. A bold gambit of material for active piece play, black injects immediate chaos into the center, challenging white's control and seeking to dislodge the encroaching knight. This sacrifice aims to open lines, particularly the d-file, which could become a highway for black's rook or queen, forcing white to react and potentially disrupting their attacking formation. It's a decisive attempt to gain the initiative by forcing white onto the defensive, hoping the complications will favor the more dynamic side. Re-establishing pressure on the central d-file with the rook seeks to disrupt black's somewhat passive piece placement and potentially exploit the slightly exposed king position. Unlocking the d-file for the rook presents an immediate challenge, forcing white to confront the advanced pawns and the doubled rooks positioned menacingly. Unlocking the d-file's potential, this recapture rips open lines towards black's compromised king, a crucial pivot in the now unbalanced material. Reclaiming the rook and solidifying the pawn structure on the d-file represents a crucial defensive maneuver, aiming to neutralize white's central pawn thrust and prevent further penetration. Unleashing a decisive tempo gain, white seizes the initiative with a swift capture, forcing a queen exchange that simplifies into a winning material advantage. The subsequent open files will be crucial for white's victory. Embracing the impending material imbalance, this queen sacrifice immediately seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay, aiming to exploit the weakened squares around the enemy king. The rook now commands the open d-file, a critical artery for controlling the center and potentially creating passed pawns. But black's king, though previously seemingly safe, is now exposed by the advanced pawn structure, making it a tempting target for coordinated attacks by white's remaining pieces. The rook's repositioning now locks down the d-file, creating a significant bottleneck that will severely restrict white's remaining pieces. Opening up the f-file with this knight sacrifice dramatically shifts the initiative, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and create immediate threats against the 7th rank, a classic tactic in King's Indian-like structures that have devolved into sharp open positions. Unleashing a desperate check, Black seeks to disrupt White's queenside dominance and potentially gain some breathing room in this increasingly unbalanced position. Attempting to leverage the open King's diagonal and the newly established rook presence on the second rank for a potential attack, though sacrificing material might leave White's own monarch exposed. Swapping off the rook dramatically alters the endgame landscape, immediately focusing attention on the exposed White monarch, now vulnerable to a potent queen and rook battery if it can't find sanctuary. Seizing the opportunity, White recaptures the pawn, initiating a decisive endgame sequence where the active rooks will be paramount. The rook's capture of the bishop now seals Black's material disadvantage. The exposed king, shorn of its central pawn shield, and with few active defenders, faces an inevitable tactical squeeze as White's pieces consolidate on the open board. Capturing the bishop solidifies White's material advantage, transforming a complex tactical battlefield into a more straightforward endgame where the extra pawn should prove decisive given Black's exposed king. This unexpected retreat of the bishop sacrifices development tempo for potential complications, but it leaves White's central pawns dangerously advanced and creates a target for the rook on the now open g-file. Bolstering your monarch's defensive perimeter becomes paramount as the board simplifies, aiming to transition smoothly into a more stable endgame position. Pushing the pawn to a4 opens up a critical diagonal for the bishop and aims to disrupt White's queenside pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited later. The king bravely marches into the fray, seeking active participation as the endgame material dwindles, aiming to support its surviving pawns. The ambitious pawn thrust suddenly opens a vital pathway for the rook to infiltrate and exploit the weakened queenside pawn structure. Opening the kingside for attack, White initiates a pawn storm with the aim of using the newly cleared diagonal to their advantage. Unleashing the pawn to force a confrontation on the queenside, threatening to break through the White pawn chain and open crucial avenues for the rook. Securing the pawn's advancement with an episcopal guardian, White prepares to dominate the queenside pawns while simultaneously keeping the diagonal open for potential future threats. Bishops often struggle when confined, and this placement aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square where it can influence the queenside pawns and potentially support a future kingside defense. Solidifying control over the central files and preparing to expand on the queenside is the clear intention behind advancing this pawn, a prudent step towards securing more territory. Unleashing a desperate pawn thrust, Black attempts to create chaos and exploit White's potentially vulnerable king, a last-ditch effort to disrupt White's advantage before a decisive endgame unfolds. The king's ventured too far from the castle walls, now exposed to enemy fire. Seeking refuge, the king abandons the contested central squares, aiming to consolidate on the kingside while White's b-pawn advances menacingly. The White king, abandoning its protective pawn shield, ventures into the liberated central terrain, a bold embrace of risk for the potential reward of active piece involvement, and to deny the Black king further sanctuary. The bishop retreats to a defensive square, preparing to support the passed pawn's advance towards the queenside promotion. The knight now lands on a crucial outpost, eyeing the pawn chain and restricting Black's queen's options while preparing to potentially join the attack on the kingside. A subtle repositioning of the bishop, aiming to prepare for a potential advance of the pawn or to offer support for the king should it become exposed. Clearing the path for the rook to activate along the b-file offers a dynamic endgame prospect, leveraging the queenside space advantage. Unearthing a hidden checker, Black jolts the king's safety net and seeks to disrupt White's burgeoning pawn structure. Capturing the bishop removes Black's last attacking piece that was poised to disrupt White's pawn structure on the queenside, simplifying the position and paving the way for a more straightforward endgame where White's extra pawn might become decisive, though vigilance against Black's remaining passed pawns is still required. The pawn's march to a promotion square injects a sudden dose of urgency into the endgame. unleashing a knight fork to shatter black's hopes of a promotion. This move exploits the precariousness of the enemy king and the unprotected square. The black king, now unescorted by pawns on the kingside, finds itself exposed to the aggressive knight's probing threat.